Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Issues of the Heart podcast. I'm your host, Brother Kobe.
Rogers Baloo.
Now, we were in a position where we shared some things last time, the origin of nations. We looked at different situations dealing with slavery. But we know that there was different, every time you read the word slave or slavery, it wasn't the same type of slavery that was in the Bible. So what are some of the other forms of slavery that's in the Bible?
Well, one of the biggest things you look at is really like indentured servants, what we would call that. And so you bring up a good point when you look at, quote, the word that you see. So just because we see a word there, it has different connotations, different meanings than what we use. Even today in society, we might use a word, but 50 years ago could have meant something entirely different than what is used for today. And so words change with time. And so we would be foolish to allow that to exist in our day-to-day living, but then don't bring that same rule to the Bible. Meaning, well, it's best to understand for what it was written and when it was written and how that word was used then. So like, for example, the word gay, when many years ago, it like in the 30s, 40s, and so forth, is really associated with meaning, happy. Now, of course, in the 80s, 90s, and it meant that you were homosexual in terms of your lifestyle, your choice. Totally different thing. So, the word stupid, like to us, it's like, you say that person's stupid. You're talking about like their mental aptitude. 100 years ago, they wasn't talking about mental aptitude, but just their performance, the way they're carrying through things. So a different aspect is there. So we want to be careful and mindful of, well, what is it, how is it used and what does it mean? So when we talk about slavery in the Bible, we find then that more than anything, again, you may see the word S-A-L-A-V-E, but it doesn't mean the same thing. And you get the better understanding, not just maybe looking at historically, but just within its context. And so when the scriptures then, we start seeing the notion then that quote, there's indentured servants. And what did that mean? Well, it meant that a person owed a debt. And by owing this debt, then that they work to be able to pay off this debt. And so in English colonies and in England, there was the note that was used there of repayment of debt. So maybe if a person owed something, they might have to be an indentured servant or a slave or a manservant or a servant for a period of time until the debt was repaid. And once the debt was repaid, then that person was now free. They were free to go back in and to execute as such. And so we start seeing this idea then of indentured servitude being brought forth. And indentured servitude was really a person, because of poor financial straits that they were in. They were obligated to someone else. They owed them money, and so they were on the hook for this. And so until they could pay off the debt, they were the quote servant of this person. Once the debt was paid, then they were now free from that. And so you'll see a lot of that in the year of Jubilee. That comes up in first and foremost, that now the quote, the slave is free. So again, not talking about you owning somebody, but that person is working to pay off a debt. So again, we're not talking about I own this person, this is my slave, but it is an indentured servant. This person owes me $500, and they're going to work until they can pay out the $500. And so even then, they were not beaten. They were not treated with cruelty and poverty, brutalized and so forth. They were just a worker. And so maybe instead of them getting, quote, cash at the end of the day, I marked off, okay, this is how much they paid towards being able to pay off their debt. And so we can see examples of that in the book of Leviticus as well as in Exodus of indentured servitude is what we would call it. Then you also see then the forbidding then of God saying, look, you treat people, remember that you were a fugitive, remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. And so what they were subjected to in Egypt, they weren't to come back, and now because they were in a position of power, to do this to other nations. So he was looking out for the well-being of other nations as well as the stability of Israel. Because when you hold people in slavery, you have to go against a lot of quote unquote good things, because you not the people aren't held into slavery just from the aspect you say, hey, you're gonna be a slave, right? You using fear, using terror. I mean, these are terrorists. People talking about terrorists and so forth. This is what you're doing. Mutilating people, abusing them, and so forth. And so this is corrupting you yourself in the process of trying to control somebody else. You become a brute. You become a demon in the process of trying to demonize somebody else. And so that's what we see taking place. And God wasn't calling his people to that. He was calling them to elevate the nation. He was calling them to holiness, to righteousness, and to purity.
I mean, you bring up a good point when you talked about that, because somebody that's held against their will, they gonna try to do things to get out of there,
By any
to
means
escape.
necessary.
And so you need to then do things to kind of keep them in check. And a lot of times you're gonna go into a lot of brutality, but when you do it, it does something to your character. So you're being when you do that, you degrade yourself, and you're also degrading the other person that you're keeping in bondage. But I want to, before I go into that aspect, I want to look at this because I want to remember this, and I want to say this to the people: is that God has been demonized because people say, "Well, God condones slavery," but we must remember, and I reiterate, Satan is the originator of sin. He is the originator of oppression. That comes from him, and so it's not something that God is keeping in place or enforcing and things of that nature.
Can I read one text
yeah.
before?
Go ahead.
Sorry. Exodus 21, just to give you something to be able to chew on and to think about. In Exodus chapter 21, I think we read some of this the other week with it. So now I have in Exodus chapter 21 in verse 20. Okay, Exodus chapter 21 and verse 20. Would you mind reading that for us? I think you have a different version, and just you may see a difference here.
If a man smite his servant or his maid with a rod, and he die under his hand, he shall surely be punished. Verse 21. Notwithstanding, if he continue a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is his money.
Okay. All right. So you're reading on from there. Now, again, in the New King James Version, it says the same thing. Again, the idea, this person owes a debt, so they're corrected for doing wrong. But now it gets a little further than that. So if they, you smote someone and you brought infliction of death on them, obviously, of course, they are free. You're going to be punished for it. But then in the other aspect in verse 26, 26 and 27.
Want me to read that?
Sure.
It says, and if a man smite the eye of his servant or the eye of his maid, that it perish, he shall let him go free for his eye's sake. And if he smite out his manservant's tooth or his maidservant's tooth, he shall let him go free for his tooth's sake.
Okay. So again, you saw now just the compassion is there. You hit somebody, right? The servant. Maybe you mad they didn't do something right. You hit them, tooth comes out. Guess what? They're free now.
Yeah.
Okay, so this was a whole different deal. In chapter 21 as well, it's a lot of laws regarding it. So you have to look at it again. This is not American slavery. This is not slavery that was imposed upon millions from the continent of Africa. This is, again, the context of an indentured servant. You afflict them, now they're free. Okay. So one other thing was in Exodus chapter 21. God said, look, if you now had a child and you say, hey, I want to stay with my master forever, then you had to, bore your ear through as a symbol that you're going to stay with them. So God was always considerate of the needs of those that were there. So it was not calling upon one race of people to enslave another race of people. This was payment of debt, but still that the servants still had rights.
Yeah.
Even though they quote unquote may not have money, but they still had rights. You couldn't just use them any type of way you wanted. They still had rights. Why? Because they were cried to God, and God was going to hear, and God was going to deal with you for mistreating them.
Yeah, and, I think about this. A while ago, my guy Mitch hit me, and I saw he had put up this thing about the slave Bible, and I'm like, the slave Bible? What is that? And so I went and looked it up, and basically the slave Bible was a Bible that the master would give to the slave. But basically, they took out every passage that pointed to God's compassion, God's wanting to free the slaves and all of these things. So when they read it, they would not have hope of being free. And so it wasn't the Bible that we have here. It was a special Bible where they purposely removed certain things so as the slave would not have hope for freedom. Because in there, all he would see was just slavery and obeying your masters and so forth, and not having that proper understanding. But I'm looking at this in Amos, and I think in Amos is something very important that God says. Now, in Amos chapter 1, God is going through a list of nations, Damascus, Gaza, Tyrus, Edom, Ammon, Moab. Now, these are heathen nations. These are the pagan nations. And God is showing why he's judging them. And a lot of times, what was mentioned was their cruelty and the slavery that they inflicted upon other people. God says, because of that, I'm punishing you. But when it came to Tyrus, he said something in particular. He says in verse 9, this is what the Lord says. The people of Tyre have sinned and sin again and again, and I will not let them go unpunished. They broke their treaty of brotherhood with Israel, selling whole villages as slaves to Edom. And I like the King James Version says they broke the brotherly covenant. Now I know historically that covenant that the king of Tyrus made with David and then again with Solomon. However, when I'm looking at this brotherly covenant, he said that they broke it in, selling the people of Israel as slaves. We have a brotherly covenant. That covenant says, love your neighbor as yourself, the golden rule. And so that brotherly covenant, when we're dealing with things like this, to be able to be involved in that, we're breaking the brotherly covenant, that bond that as brothers of one of the same blood, you're actually breaking that covenant that God has for us. And so, when you see that right there, they're breaking that bond that God desired, this golden cord of love that should exist between brother and brother, that's being broken when you involve yourself in these type of acts. Now, I want to look at something, because we talked about indentured servanthood, and that's how the thing about it is, that was so, now we kind of look at it like, oh, that's a strange thing, but that's still being practiced today, by the way, in other parts of the world. But that was something that was just so prevalent back in those days, because if somebody owed you, how you gonna get this guy to pay you, right? and so they worked out a system. It was like, all right, if you owe a certain amount of money, then you would basically go in and work for that person until that debt was paid. And also, when we talk about our prison system today, nobody gets mad if they say, hey, this person in prison that did this crime, that they are working for pennies on the dollar while they're in prison because they did the crime. We say, well, he's paying his debt to society. Well, if that's the case, and if you're not mad at that, well, let's look at this. Exodus chapter 22, verses 3. It's talking about the thief. It said, a thief who is caught must pay in full for everything he stole. If he cannot pay, he must be sold as a slave to pay for his theft. Think about that. So if you're a thief, you break in somebody's house and you take their stuff, you get caught and you don't, because you just can't pay, what you took. He said, this is restitution. You got to pay fourfold. Yeah. Right? He's like, well, I ain't got no money. He's like, okay, well, you're going to be going to servanthood. You're going to work until you pay off that debt. And so people look at this and say, that was almost like the prison system today. You're going to pay your debt to society. And so we have things like that in the Word of God, that indentured servanthood. You have this here in 2 Kings chapter 4 and verse 1. And we see this was a part of, the culture then, and this is how people paid for things. It says, one day the widow of a member of a group of prophets came to Elisha and cried out, my husband who served you is dead, and you know how he feared the Lord. But now a creditor has come, threatening to take my 2 sons as slaves. And so here you have a situation where the husband is dead. He owed a debt. The wife is like, well, I don't got no money. And most likely back then, she probably wasn't working. And so he was probably the sole provider. So now there's this debt that is there. And the collectors, they're coming and say, well, if you don't have money to pay, well, we're going to take your sons. Not in the captivity that we think of today, but as indentured servants. They're going to come work for us to pay off this money. And so that's there in the Bible. And so it's interesting, there's a story in the New Testament that Jesus gave a parable. And he talked about there was this king, and he was going to take accounts, and he found out some of his servants, his accounts had this massive debt. So he said, all right, well, you don't have the money to pay. Well, I'm going to take you, your family, your stuff, and, sell you and see whatever I can get back from it. And so the man just pleaded for mercy. He said, all right, you know what? I'll forgive you. And so the man goes, and basically the man owed, in today's translation, would be millions of dollars in debt. He ain't paying it, right? So he goes out and he meets his fellow servant that basically in today's translation would be a couple of dollars, right? And so he's asked the same mercy and compassion. He's like, nope. You're going to be put in this position until you pay it all. The point I'm making with that is, the mind state of God is, because that king representative of Jesus, he would freely forgive. But the attitude of man is, nah, I ain't forgiving nothing. You're going to pay me, And so God has an authoritative will. And there's also his permissive will. And what that means is, like in the case of divorce, God says, listen, God granted you this bill of divorcement, not because that's the mind of God, because the hardness of your heart. He knows your evil nature and how you are. And so he permits it. So you got God's authoritative will be something like his 10 Commandments. That's unwavering. It's not going to bend. God's not going to change that. It is what it is. You either fall in line or fall away from it, right? He's not changing that. But then you have God's permissive will, things that he permits that's not his ideal. Like when Israel decided that they were going to get a king, God said, I'm your king. He never wanted them to have a king. However, when you read in Deuteronomy chapter 17, God set guidelines that when you get a king, is that one day you're going to reject me, but when you get a king, and the desire to have a king means you want to be like the other nations. And not only will you have a king like the other nations, you will start to run your government and to do things like these other nations as well. So let me set some perimeters, some guidelines to you as kings, to how you rule, to protect the people. So that's God's permissive will. Another case of that, you can look at the story of Balaam, right? So here it is, Balak comes to him because he's afraid of Israel. He wants them to curse his people. And so he prays about, like, you need to pray about that. We over here praying for things we don't need to pray for. We know the mind of God on it. And so he prays, God tells him no. And so he sends the people away. So they come back offering him more money. Goes and prays to God again. He already knew the will of God, but he prays again. You're praying for stuff you already know the mind of God on. So he goes and chases after him, knowing the mind of God. And so we know the story. The donkey sees the angel and just gives up. And so he starts to beat the donkey. And the donkey's like, basically, bro, you see this, man? And so the angel of the Lord that is there didn't tell him, go back. He said, nah, you can go ahead and go. This is God's permissive will. We know the authoritative will of God said, don't go. God permitted and said, listen, you can go, but I'm going to give you guidelines. I'm going to set some parameters. When you go, you can only say the words that I put in your mouth because you can't curse Israel. And so we have to understand in Scripture there's some God's authoritative will and there's a permissive will. God says, I understand the hardness of your heart that you're going to do certain things. So he said, let me guard the people against tyranny. And that's why we read that, hey, if you hit your servant or treated them brutally, they can go free. And another provision that was there is that when somebody would go into servitude, it was never to be perpetual. I said the limit is 7 years. So as long as you can hold somebody, they go owe you $1 million, and they probably take their whole lifetime to pay it. You think, I got you as a servant for life. God said, no, 7 years, top that off. And so there was guidelines that God had to guard against. Now, the other nations may have done it a bit differently, but God says, let me set parameters here to guard the people against this. But we know the mind of God, he would have freely forgave the debt. But understanding man, you're like, I ain't forgiving nothing. He go out and choke the servant. So that's one of the things that we can learn from that, is that God is not into this type of thing of oppressing people. He constantly spoke concerning that. So that's clear from the Word of God.
Interesting story that you use in not just a story, but the principle that God had established in terms of like the year Jubilee. That's what it was called, the Jubilee year. And so it was like 7 years. And from one aspect, from a selfish aspect, like if you needed money, let's just say put a dollar amount, you needed maybe $100,000, right? And you nearest a kin, you come to me, and it's like, all right, you could give your property, and if it wasn't enough, then I still would have an obligation to help you. Yeah. But I couldn't look at when the year Jubilee would come, so because I look at it like, man, this fool's crazy. This next year, he can't pay me back in a year. No, the answer is no. Yeah. But if it was 6 years away or 7 years away, then I'd be like, yeah, okay, my break even, if you give me like, $20,000 a year or $15,000 a year, I'll break even. But he wasn't to look at that. And again, that goes back to God was trying to give them, I want you to be compassionate. I want you to never forget where you came from. And sometimes as Christians, forget, quote, the black race, but just as Christians, as human beings, sometimes, we forget from where God has brought us from. We forget those who are still suffering, those who are still downtrodden. And we act like, oh, we made it here. You figure it out on your own. That's you. You got to figure it out. But no, you're willing to offer a hand, to be able to give assistance. And yeah, people need to take advantage of the opportunity being afforded them. You can't have it spoon-fed. But there's always compassion that's being exhibited. And so this is a part of the character of God. Because as you mentioned, he's like, you're going to do this. But let me put some parameters there so that you can still be as softened as possible and not hard-hearted and stoic as you're trying to go about this.
Now let's look at this, because we're dealing with slavery and the thought of restitution. All right, so the restitution conversation has been going on. Like, hey, we haven't got our 40 acres and a mule yet, so when we gonna get our slice? These other people, they got theirs, and so we waiting on ours, and so we had it the hardest, but y'all ain't gave us nothing. But these people, y'all gave them their thing, so we want ours. So is restitution, is that biblical? Does God have it that if somebody serves you and they were released, should they get paid?
That's a great question. I hope, do we have time to go into that now?
Yeah,
or?
we got some time.
All right, cool.
Yeah,
all right,
10 minutes.
We got 10 minutes. So it's a great question. What does the Bible then say about the topic of restitution? Well, we can see a couple different things. One, I think we've established that indentured servitude is different from restitution. That's like, I owe you. Yeah. That's entirely different. But when a person has been defrauded, when a person has been ripped off, when a person has been taken advantage of, then that's a different thing. So in this context of conversation, we're going to set it up in that parameter. And we were clear that blacks were definitely taken advantage of. And so people might, throw out, well, they're taken from a dark continent and brought over to being light. Well, no, let's go back and look at history. Because history, we can look at different examples in the Bible and history that there were scores of Christianity existed in the continent of Africa. So don't think for a moment, quote unquote, people were walking around, buck naked and there's, swinging off of trees and so forth. It's like when I went to Africa, and again, so think continent. The continent is Africa, different countries there. But it was interesting because we took pictures because it's like, you look around, not everywhere, but you have BMWs on this, high-rise buildings. You have your water and so forth. Same things you have here. But if you look at how people would try to portray it, you would think, all right, well, you in the middle of the sticks. People don't have anything. They got like a little zebra cloth walking around alone and just so forth. Riding horse and camel, have nothing. No, it wasn't like that at all. And I'm not saying that there aren't places like that, but again, in America, we can go 5 miles and you can be in the most opulent neighborhood. You can go 5 miles another direction, people don't have running water. Okay, I mean, you can go to Flint, Michigan. You can run. So it is dependent upon maybe what you're looking at, where you are, and so forth. So going back to, well, what is God's pattern? Well, the pattern is we can start seeing with the children of Israel. They were slaves in Egypt, and so again, when they said, "Look, we want to go," Pharaoh was like, "You ain't going nowhere. It's free labor. Why am I letting you out to leave? This is, I'm not paying you. All I'm doing is giving you a little bit of scraps to eat, a little bit of clothing," just like, again, slavery in this country and in many other countries as well. So when they left, though, they were told to go and to borrow of the Egyptians, get their gold, get their jewels, and so forth. And this is going to be your payment back for when you leave out. And so it's important because they were going out, and even when you parallel it to blacks in this country, when you leave out of slavery and you're destitute and you don't have anything, what are you going to turn to? And it's similar in the penal system here. If you've done wrong, should you pay for your crime? Yeah, absolutely, you should pay for your crime. But if we can't find a way then so that when a person goes back out, okay, because if all I knew was hustling and selling drugs and running little scams, that's what I'm gonna turn back to. Generally speaking, not everybody, but generally speaking, I may try to walk the straight and narrow, but if I can't get a job, then okay, I'm hungry. What am I going to turn back to? What am I going to resort to, and so forth? So God had Israel to come out, and they were to have this money as payment for their years of service. And so from that one perspective, and we can look at some other examples, but from that one perspective, then no, restitution is in order. You served for 400 years, and you don't have a dime. And you're just saying, okay, you free? Just go live off the land. How? You can't. I mean, what are you going to catch? What you can catch a deer with? What you catch a turkey with? You may be fast, but again, you need to have the resources there. So the Bible then will give us a paradigm then of what do you do in that particular case.
Well, one of the things, looking at, there's another form of, slavery's cousin, if you will, which is poverty. I think about these texts in the Bible. The Bible says in Proverbs 22, verse 7, the rich rules over the poor, and the borrower is servant to the lender. Now, we've quoted those before, but think about, wait a minute. the borrower is servant to the lender. The rich rules over the poor. And you know, you think about James said something in particular when he wrote to the church, and he talked about how they was partial, how they treated the rich people better than they treated the poor people in the church. And he said, well, aren't it the rich people that rule over you and oppress you? And so one of the things about keeping people impoverished is that we saw what they did here was that they forbid black people to read, to educate themselves. Because if you keep a person in ignorance, you can keep them in poverty. Because we can let you go free, but if you're in ignorance, you will never elevate yourself. Mm-hmm. You never really become. You will never become great, and so you stay low on the totem pole. And so part of this oppression was to keep a person in ignorance. And we see also, God talks about in the book of James. Also, he talks about the rich man weeping and howling for their miseries that shall come upon them. And he's talking about how their money was corrupted. Well, why was it? He said, well, they were oppressing people. He said, you know, you had these people doing all this labor and you weren't paying them. You weren't giving them their just due. And so they done crap at God, and God's going to one day take vengeance on that, he says. And so you brought up the situation with the children of Israel. God said, hey, you're going to be rewarded. He compensated them. But when they left there was an education that God needed to give his people as well. Because a lot of them were in ignorance. And so God said, well, I need to educate you. And that's why he was so strict and stern about learning these things, teaching it to your children. And so he can elevate them morally, spiritually, mentally, because they had been so degraded. But also when the children of Israel came out of Babylonian captivity, you know, all the treasures that Nebuchadnezzar had took from them and different things, Cyrus began to give to them like here, you know, so they were restored some things. So they didn't just leave empty-handed. They said, no. Here, take this, take that. And so for me, I'm looking at restitution, not just in the form, I want the money. Don't get me wrong with that. You know, but I think another way of restitution, blacks have free education. You know, so free education, to be able to educate ourselves and to prosper. And, you know, a lot of times, just on average, the people that's super uber rich, like the basketball players, entertainers, man, but to be able to have that education and not have to worry about this massive debt that you're going to collect when you go to college and get this higher education. So one of the things that I look at with restitution is, again, yes, the money, but, you know, if you're not giving that, hey, what about our education? Because that's something you deprived us of, all of those things. And we see why they fought so hard to keep blacks out of certain schools, because you're getting a superior education. You have better things there, and you don't want us to have the same equal learning that you have, because you want to keep us down here. So I think as far as restitution, hey, our education, let that be free. You know, all that debt that black people owe for going to college, hey, wipe that out. You know,
well, if you're talking about restitution and so forth, then I just would say we can't pay taxes then. And I say that because you know, if you're saying, hey, I'm gonna give you $100, but I'm still paying taxes, and I'm paying my own $100. You know, it's like so I can't pay taxes in. So you know, I don't mind setting it up. Well, okay, I'm not paying taxes in that respect, and then I'm gonna receive restitution, and that's fair enough. But if you say, okay, here I'm gonna give you, you know, $100,000, $200,000, but you're gonna pay 30-40% taxes on it, or you can quote go to school for free. But I'm still paying taxes on it, then all right, it's really free. Because there's no such thing as a free lunch. So just had to throw that in there.
Well, you know, going back just to recap, you know, we talked about there's different forms of slavery. There was a slavery clearly that God condemned. Said this is, you know, matter of fact, it's a violation of his 10 Commandments. But there's other type of slavery, and I don't even know what we should call it, but when you read the Bible just on the surface level, it seems as though, oh, this is a slavery that God's condoning. But we understand what it is. And so this indentured servanthood that's there. And so we understand what that is and so forth. But God set parameters even around that. Well, we know what the mind of God was concerning it. But also, you know, looking at, you know, modern slavery, yes, it's gotten into restitution, and that would be the thing. Not saying we gonna get it. We hope we do, but you know, but restitution is biblical. You see that with the children of Israel in Egypt. You see them when they live in Babylonian captivity. You see it in James, how the people were being defrauded. So yes, God is into restitution, and those who are defrauded should be repaid for their labor. And so hopefully we covered these things, and we can, wipe some of the things that people perceive or believe about God and what he condoned, and people can understand the loving God that he is, and that he didn't condone these things, and really place our where it should be, on the devil who created and originated this ugly thing that's out there. And so let us remember that. But next time, hopefully, we want to cover something very particular with black people, a thought that's always kind of running around. But for this episode, we're done. Pray that you remember the proverb, keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life.